Hello, and welcome to The Third Space, the podcast for those who see the beauty of Catholicism as well as the ugliness, who've experienced real harm and real grace in the Church. I'm your host, Paul Fahey, a mental health counselor and catechist, and every episode I will have conversations with guests about the good and the bad in the Church, avoiding easy answers or black and white fundamentalism, in order to hold on to all that is true. Today I'm talking with Dr. Julia Sadusky about conversion therapy. And just a heads up, if you're listening with kids, we'll be having frank conversations about sex and gender in this episode. Before we get into the episode, I wanted to let you know that I've opened registration for my spiritual abuse workshop. This is a 5-part live workshop that will meet virtually once a week, starting in the middle of April. This workshop will help you recognize and prevent spiritual abuse and abuse of conscience in the Church, know the symptoms of spiritual abuse, religious trauma, and moral injury, and better understand and respond to abusive systems in the Church. Visit CatholicThirdSpace.com for more details. Dr. Julia Sadusky is an author, speaker, and licensed psychologist. She owns Lux Counseling and Consulting in Littleton, Colorado, where she offers individual, family, and couples therapy, in addition to consultations for individuals and families around sexuality and gender. She also serves as a ministry educator, offering trainings and consultations to counseling centers and faith-based institutions on sexuality, gender identity, mental health, trauma-informed care, and the intersection of sexuality, gender, and theology. Other areas of focus include work with those experiencing complex trauma and eating disorders. Dr. Sadusky's most recent books are Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, and Talking with Your Teen About Sex, A Practical Guide for Catholics, both from Ave Maria Press. She's also co-authored 2 books, including Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experiences of Today's Youth, and Gender Identity and Faith, Clinical Postures, Tools, and Case Studies for Client-Centered Care, along with Mark Yarhouse. She's also contributed to 4 Views books titled Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 Views from Baker Academic. Now, Julia, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much.
It's so good to be with you, Paul.
Yeah, I received some really positive feedback from people after our episode a couple of months ago about your books on talking with your kids about sex. I heard from people that it was really encouraging for them. I think both as parents and also in understanding some of like their own stories growing up, and what was taught or not taught to them. So yeah, I'm so grateful to have you back on. For this conversation, though, we're going to talk about something different, but still very much related to the work that you do professionally. And so we're going to be talking about conversion therapy and using the current lawsuit in Colorado as kind of like the focal point or thing that we're orbiting this conversation around in a lot of ways. There's a lawsuit in Colorado about conversion therapy that was recently argued before the Supreme Court this term. You submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court for this case, and we are waiting. We are recording this at the end of March. Any week now, we could get a decision from the Supreme Court. But I wanted to have you on to discuss conversion therapy as a whole, some of its history, and some of its both psychological and theological groundings, and then this case specifically, and how if this Colorado law is struck down, which it probably will be, at least that's where things are pointing, how that could impact in a negative way therapists in general, but also specifically Catholic therapists. I just put a lot of stuff on the table. I think to start, I would love to hear, what is your specific expertise in these areas of gender and sexuality? And then also, how did you come to be a Catholic expert? So what drew you to these areas? And then also, why as a Catholic do you feel like engaging in these topics is important?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so I should say, I went to undergrad at Ave Maria University in South Florida, and it was there that I really took an interest in human sexuality much more broadly than kind of specific to sexual orientation or gender. So I studied under Mikhail Waldstein, who translated Theology of the Body from, its original form into English. And he taught me kind of, and we walked through that whole book, just kind of, there are all those writings about human sexuality. And so that was the first time, I think, as a Catholic, I came to a real appreciation for just the Catholic vision for human sexuality. And at the same time, Paul, I was having people in my life share with me that they were attracted to the same sex, and they were people of faith. They were people who were seeking ministries and therapies to change their sexual orientation. And they really believed that those approaches were going to be effective for them. And so at that time, as a young college student, I was getting asked questions from my close friends about, is a person going to hell if their attractions don't change? And I think that was really striking at the time. And it launched me into my own journey of trying to understand what is a Catholic vision for people who experience same-sex attraction. And as I did that kind of research and looking into what the church had to say, and of course, I was studying psychology at the time, so I was kind of understanding a vision of sexuality as it is applied in psychology. It really struck me that there was really nothing that was being offered that was a kind of integration of psychology and Catholic theology when it came to these topics. And there was even, maybe equally importantly, no guidance for people like me about how to walk with people I loved who had these experiences. And so I came across Mark Yarhouse's work, and he's a psychologist who specializes as a person of faith in sexuality and gender. And he was at Regent. And so that was where I ended up going to get my doctorate, was to study under him, to do research with people of faith who are navigating these questions. So we had an outward facing clinic at Regent. We developed a subclinic around sexuality and gender in particular, and we started to really do a ton of lines of original research, looking at questions like, how do Christian parents respond when a loved one comes out? What are helpful things to do and say, and what are unhelpful things to do and say? And before I knew it, about half of my caseload was these families. And so that really shaped, I think, a lot of my original understanding. It's also worth mentioning, something I don't often speak publicly about is that at that time, I was really interested in this idea of conversion therapy. I mean, I knew of Joseph Nicolosi Sr., who was a Catholic, who had a clinic in California, and he was really an advocate for efforts to, the way he framed it was kind of reparative therapy. So to kind of repair wounds in ways that help people experience heterosexuality. And so I was studying and reading some of his resources. I was looking at some of his work, and I actually had the opportunity to summarize the literature in this area of conversion therapy, in the area of causal pathways for sexual orientation. And so I actually worked under him on a project that allowed me to summarize that line of research. And as I did that research and was reporting on what I was reading from the literature, it really struck me that there were more questions than answers when it came to what we know about causal paths. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but there was a lot I learned about those causal theories, about the ways they were applied in conversion therapy and, in particular, reparative therapy. And I found those theories and also the research behind them really lacking in a kind of a sufficient base to say anything with confidence. So I became very sober when it came to assertions about causal paths. And it also made me really interested in finding therapeutic approaches that don't focus on orientation change as such, but also don't presume some of the more mainstream narratives about human sexuality. And that really led me to, work with Mark and develop approaches in therapy and use his approaches that he had already developed to offer something different from conversion therapy and also different from the kind of prominent gay affirmative therapy approach.
Yeah. So it would be helpful for me, so I'm going to assume it'd be helpful for the audience to like lay some groundwork here in. I mean, I think one of the key questions in the national discussion about conversion therapy and in the legal discussion about conversion therapy is, what is conversion therapy? I think like pinning down a definition seems to be a key thing, but that also seems like the place to start. So you used the word conversion therapy. You used also, you talked about reparative therapy. I know conversion therapy can talk about the changing of sexual orientation, but I've also seen it used to refer to the changing of one's gender also. So, yeah, can you jump in with what is conversion therapy and how are people using this word in different ways?
Yeah, so conversion therapy is really difficult to define, which is part of the controversy around laws in this area is what are we even talking about when we refer to conversion therapy? So the way I would define conversion therapy is it's any form of therapy that sets as a treatment goal the change of a person's sexual orientation, which involves the kind of enduring direction of your attraction. So, who am I oriented towards romantically and sexually? Or changing a person's gender identity. So, claiming that I know how to, in treatment, make a person align with their biological sex or align with a different kind of gender identity. So it's twofold. It's what are my treatment goals and what are my claims about what I can guarantee to people as an outcome of our work together in this realm. And that captures, I think, conversion therapy as it's been applied. And I guess I'll add to your question of like, the complexity of how people use it differently is I think, there's concerns about a kind of associating sexual orientation and gender identity in conversion therapy. But I think it's worth understanding that people who offered these types of therapy historically did accept clients who had gender questions. They often thought of it in the same way as a kind of arrested masculinity or femininity. So they themselves would have seen both clients, which is why we have to kind of account for both, even though they're different experiences when we're talking about conversion therapy.
So your definition in some ways is quite broad, right? You said any form of therapy that sets as a treatment goal, changing orientation or gender identity, any form of therapy. I think that there's in the kind of the general imagination in discussions about conversion therapy, the idea that it is like crude electroshock therapy, that it's a particular kind of therapy or kind of treatment. And you're saying something more broad than that. So, yeah, I guess what is that conception? Like, was that ever a thing? Why is, maybe that's a different question. I think I want to start with, like, what are the origins of conversion therapy? And, maybe eventually get to then the specific treatments are maybe less important than the way you're framing it of setting as a goal of no matter what the particular modality is, that it's the goal of changing orientation or gender identity, that's what makes it conversion therapy.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So
Go ahead.
these laws,
yeah, clean up the mess
right?
of what I just said.
That's so great. So these laws, right, are directed towards therapists, right? Because therapists are critical in establishing treatment goals. We're also critical in offering modalities or treatment approaches. And so the law is not to say a person can't have as a hope or a goal in their life or in therapy a change of attraction orientation. This law is meant to focus on what the therapist is promising and offering. And in that way, it can involve any form of therapy. So you asked about what is the history of conversion therapy? And the reason why we need a broad definition like what I mentioned is because there are plenty of different modalities that have been used to try to change a person's sexual orientation or attraction. So you have behaviorists who have done things like, put the rubber band on your wrist and flick your wrist every time you see somebody attractive, in the hopes that if we pair a kind of pain response with a pleasure response, we can shift how the brain is responding to the person across from me. And so if I'm feeling pain when I see an attractive person, perhaps over time my attraction will shift in a heterosexual way. And so that was a behaviorist maybe way of kind of targeting attraction. There's other, you mentioned kind of more intensive kind of electroconvulsive shock. And certainly there are older kind of medical and therapeutic interventions that would have involved that. That would be the most extreme. And I have not personally ever met with a person who endured those. I've seen movies but I think that even generationally has fallen out of favor well before these laws were established. And so that would be another form of kind of efforts to, again, pair a kind of disgust or a pain response with something pleasurable. That's been used across different sexual attractions and even fetishes over time. So that has a broader history to it than just this. What I would say is that another kind of prominent way conversion therapy has manifest is in the realm of kind of psychoanalytic theory or psychodynamic theories. So think in terms of Freud, thinks in terms of how does a person's relationship with their parent impact their symptoms in life. And so for a person who believes, for instance, that a smothering mother or a distant father leads to a kind of arrested masculinity or arrested feminine development. And so that child then sexualizes that unmet need, and that manifests in same-sex attraction at puberty. That would be another prominent theory that was used to kind of justify therapeutic interventions to repair those kinds of faulty relationships, those faulty relational scripts. And so if I can heal those unmet needs, perhaps I will stop sexualizing people of the same sex. That was another theory. And so the kind of most recent, I guess, like immersion or kind of clarification of this that I see is something called reintegrative therapy, which says, we can think of same-sex attraction or gender distress as trauma symptoms. And so if we address the traumas that underlie these experiences, we can experience kind of a relief from the symptom of same-sex attraction. Yeah. All of those terms are kind of, in my mind, setting as the treatment goal change of attraction or orientation.
Yeah, so there's three different terms here. There's conversion therapy, reparative therapy, and reintegrative therapy. Mm-hmm. Could you just give a quick, how are these things the same and how are they distinct from each other?
Yeah, so conversion therapy, again, is an umbrella term to talk about the many forms of therapy or therapeutic approaches that aim to shift attraction and orientation as the established treatment goal. Reparative therapy is a specific therapy developed by Joseph Nicolosi Sr., who's a Catholic who has since passed away. And his approach was kind of framing same-sex attraction as an arrested masculinity or femininity, and even gender distress as a kind of developmental freezing, if you will, in a way that manifests in same-sex attraction at puberty and gender questions and insecurity about oneself. And he had several kind of theories of why that might be, whether it was trauma, whether it was parent-child relationships, whether it was bullying and kind of harms peer rejection. And so that was reparative therapy. And he had his own approach that was not behavioral in nature. The people I've met with who worked with him at some point did not get electroconvulsive shock therapy. So that's maybe a little bit about his approach, which again would have incorporated different therapeutic modalities under the goal of seeing these shifts. Reintegrative therapy is actually developed by Joseph Nicolosi Jr., so Nicolosi Sr.'s son. And His framing around his approach from his website is that it is trauma therapy that incorporates mindfulness, incorporates EMDR, and kind of looks at a person's history of arousal and fantasy as kind of a map to understand traumas. And then when we kind of approach the trauma, we can address the trauma. And in some cases, he has kind of offered attraction change as a established goal, something they measure in the research that has been following that approach. In other times, and more recently, he's kind of pulled back some of that from what I've observed online. And so uh, I'll kind of let him maybe speak for himself as far as what he's saying there. But from what I observe of that approach, it looks to me like a rebranding of reparative therapy, an application of different modalities, mindfulness, EMDR, in ways that are still operating from the exact same theory of homosexuality, that it's a kind of trauma symptom, which departs from how the field understands homosexuality, but also is not the framing of it in terms of our Catholic faith.
So it sounds like with all of this, then, or at least specifically with these two therapies, there's the like some psychological like assumptions, like premises here. So it sounds like there's the underlying premise that anything other than heterosexual orientation is like psychologically disordered in some way, and anything other, and any type of gender dissonance is psychologically disordered in some way, and that those disorders are caused by either trauma or attachment issues, most likely early on in life. Is that a fair summary of like the psychological assumptions that these therapies have?
I think that's right. I think there is an assumption of psychopathology here in the psychological sense, right? Like, I think, many Catholics listening might think in terms of disorder when it's talked about in terms of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it says disorder as outside of or against the natural order of things. When we talk about disorder, pathology, and psychology, we're actually talking about something different. We're talking about kind of established mental health diagnoses, right? And so I think the assumption made is that these experiences are symptoms of a mental health concern that ought to be treated, and that we actually ought to expect that if you treat trauma or attachment wounds, there will be an eradication of these symptoms. And that is an interesting claim, even in terms of psychology, right? Because I think we've shifted as a field away from seeing ourselves as curers of mental health symptoms resolutely, but more of how do we reduce the kind of being pushed around by these things. And so, but this gets at more of a fundamental claim that if we can treat the trauma, we can get rid of the symptoms, and these would be seen as symptoms in that framework.
Yeah, I really appreciate you like making that clarification between a psychopathology and and what in Catholic terminology we talk about, like a disordered attraction or a disordered desire. Because in Catholic theology, any desire for anything that goes against the moral law is considered a disordered desire, right? Like if if I covet something that someone else has, that's a disordered desire. If I want more wealth and material goods than what I actually need to live a dignified life, like that is a disordered desire. If I want a sexual relationship with someone who isn't my spouse, that's a disordered desire. Okay. But the key thing you said is that the psychological presumption under conversion therapy is that sexual orientation that isn't heterosexual is a psychopathology.
Correct.
It seems like then a theological presumption or foundation of both reparative and reintegrative therapy is kind of a blending of psychopathology and moral disorder. Is that a fair summary of that position?
That's a really, really interesting thought. I think that's what I see happening in Catholic circles around this. Is it seems as if to people that when we're talking about moral disorder, we're also talking about psychological disorder at the same time. And so that has enormous implications for, I think, the way in which conversion therapy has been kind of absorbed in our circles, because I think that nuance gets lost
Yeah.
in a really
It,
significant way.
and when you put it in a different context, like it becomes really clear. So like my wife and I, we are trying to buy a house.
Mm-hmm.
We just got outbid on a house, right? Like I can feel a level of jealousy and covetousness towards the person who bid higher on the house than my wife and I did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a psychopathology.
Correct. Correct. I mean, another good example of this is having an affair, right? We could see infidelity, committing adultery as clearly within the moral framework, as morally problematic. It's a commandment, right? That we see as causing severe harm to families and people more broadly, and we would not have a mental health diagnosis for affairs. And I also would not offer at the start of therapy that if you come to see me, I can guarantee you will never have an affair in your life, right? Or never desire another person in that way as a consequence of our work. So again, we don't have a mental health diagnosis for infidelity. We may have it for, compulsive sexual acting out or something like that. But we don't have a mental health diagnosis, and we don't have established treatment protocols that guarantee you will never be unfaithful. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. What are the other psychological and theological assumptions of reparative and reintegrative therapy?
You know, I do think that as far as the psychological assumptions, one of the things I've thought a lot about as I've been reflecting through all of the things we're talking about today is just how I'm a trauma therapist. I work with survivors of trauma. And if a person could come in and say to me, I know where my PTSD started. Like it started here. I know why I have flashbacks. It started when I was 3 or when I was 10, and these things happened. I am not suggesting or claiming in therapy, and I'm actually tempering the hope that through our therapy, if we do EMDR, or if we do, long-term psychodynamic therapy, whatever we do, ACT, DBT, I'm not claiming that they will never have a flashback again. I'm not claiming they will never have trauma symptoms again through our work. Now, why do therapy at all? Well, you're doing therapy to really help build the skills and the abilities to live their lives in ways that glorify God, that are more psychologically free and integrated, so they're not as pushed around by the experiences from the past. Okay. So I think an assumption that's made through conversion therapy, especially when it relates to attachment ruptures or trauma, is actually promising that you will never have the symptoms if we concede that that has anything to do with it, which I'm not inclined to concede. But even if we did, I think there's an assumption of an eradication of symptoms by insight alone. And that departs from, I think, what we have research evidence for claiming when it comes to therapy. And I guess I'll say one thing as far as what are the theological assumptions. I think one is what you've already mentioned, which is the superimposing moral disorder on psychopathology and assuming they're one and the same. I do think, and I've thought a lot about this, how in some frameworks of specifically American Christianity, which is the Christianity I'm part of, it may be represented in other parts of the world, there is this framework of kind of, we know God exists and is good and in loving when our suffering goes away. And we know that we are in right relationship with God when we psychologically are kind of the way we want to be psychologically. And I think that healing framework of like, God is good if I'm healed had seeped in also to some of these understandings. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, when it talks about homosexuality, talks about kind of carrying the cross of homosexuality. What I perceive in some of the conversion therapy approaches is God, a claim that God would like for this cross to not be there anymore, and that there's psychological ways to take away that cross. And isn't it the loving thing to let people, lay down that cross and not have to carry it anymore? And I think that's a healing ministry framework that comes a bit more from prosperity gospel kind of understandings of sanctification than from a Catholic vision that absolutely accounts for enduring suffering, and not just enduring suffering for the sake of enduring suffering, but enduring suffering that's been transfigured and transformed and is already bearing kind of the glorification, right, that is promised to us. And so I think that's a very different theological framework there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. I have all these like buzzers going off in my head. Some of it from some of the research out there on spiritual abuse is that theological beliefs that are red flags for spiritually abusive cultures and churches is the belief that it's precisely that transactional belief. God will always heal me if I ask him to. And it reminds me of, I've been reading through De Lexite, again, Pope Leo's apostolic exhortation on the poor. And in one section of that document, I'll read from it here. This is paragraph 22. He says, in that time, the needy and the sick, lacking the necessities of life, frequently found themselves forced to beg. They thus bore the added burden of social shame due to the belief that sickness and poverty were somehow linked to personal sin. Jesus firmly countered this mentality by insisting that God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends the rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Indeed, Jesus completely overturned that notion. Something fundamental to the revelation of God through Scripture and tradition is that God is not transactional. And we see this in the gospel stories where there's a scene in the gospels where there's a blind man and the apostles go up to Jesus and they're like, so was it this man who sinned that caused his blindness, or his parents' sin that caused his blindness, right? And again, Jesus just dismisses those categories altogether. But then the apostles follow up and they're like, but who? So there's that. But then there's also the flip side of that coin, which is that wealth and health is a sign of God's blessing. So when Jesus would condemn the wealthy and say it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, the apostles follow that up with saying, but the who then can be saved? They're asking that question because they're acting with the presumption that if the rich can't be saved, then, and they're the most blessed by God, then how could the rest of us be saved? But Jesus says, blessed are the poor. So this transactional theology that you're identifying, I think is a perpetual temptation through every age of the church, is to see God in a transactional way. So yeah, like even as you're saying this, seeing how, like, I've been in a lot of Catholic charismatic spaces, seeing how this reintegrative therapy can get easily wrapped up in the theology of like charismatic healing. Oh yeah, I've definitely seen that happen. And yeah, the root theological like problem is the belief that healing is a sign of God's blessing and suffering is a sign of personal sin.
That's right. And healing in the present, right? It's a very clear, in the present, I can know that God is good and that he loves me and that I'm in right relationship with him, when in the present There is an eradication of the things that are difficult for me, that God wants these things gone now. And I think we as Catholics can hold that in the broader kind of divine economy, that in heaven, all will be made well. All will be rightly ordered morally. All will be rightly ordered psychologically, that there will be a kind of resurrected body that is brought to full perfection. The question is that what we're here for now? Is that what God has for us here? And I think I would disagree with the Catholic who offers conversion therapy around sexual orientation. I see God glorified in John 9, what you're referencing about the blind man. Jesus says, this happened so the glory of God could be made manifest in him. I see that happening all the time in the lives of faithful Catholics and faithful Christians with experiences of same-sex sexuality, with experiences of gender distress. God is glorified in their lives in the present, and they have these enduring experiences that I can't heal.
So, okay, we've talked about how the theological assumptions behind reintegrative and reparative therapy aren't in line with the Catholic Church's theology. It's also clear to me that the psychological presumptions are way outside the norm for the psychological and mental health professions in the United States. I mean, even just the presumption that that homosexuality is a psychopathology is very much outside the norm. But it's not just a cultural norm. Like, these psychological presumptions are also outside of like what we know through research. Is that correct? Can you speak into that?
Yeah, so again, homosexuality in particular was framed as a psychological disorder for a long time, and so it was in the 70s that shifted, and that shift happened after some research done where they were really trying to look at, is the experience of same-sex attraction as such leading to psychological problems for people, right? Not moral problems, not philosophical problems. Like, was it causing additional risk for mental health concerns by virtue of you having these attractions? And when they looked at the broad swath of people who had same-sex attraction, they were finding a normal distribution of what you would expect in the broader, heterosexual population in terms of psychopathology. So there was no kind of this group of people is uniquely psychologically disordered, although this group of people had a higher percentage of depression, anxiety, and other things than the general population. But it could no longer be causally claimed that these attractions themselves were making every person with these attractions psychologically symptomatic, because there were plenty of same-sex attracted people who had no signs of psychopathology, much in the same way that we see with heterosexually attracted people. And so that really tempered that kind of assertion and pulled back that diagnosis, along with certainly political motives. I mean, I think we can concede that there are philosophical understandings of the person that would also lead people to be invested in not having that diagnosis be there. In the realm of gender, of course, gender dysphoria is a diagnosis. It is a diagnosed mental health concern for the kind of specific symptoms that it brings and the inhibiting of functioning for people, certainly. But in the realm of homosexuality in particular, that diagnosis has moved completely out of favor. There's not been a strong push to bring that back. I think everybody recognizes that people with attraction to the same sex are a marginalized group who can experience all kinds of challenges when it comes to social and relational domains, and but the attractions themselves are not understood as the cause of those challenges. Only, I guess, could be thought of as the kind of variable that's a catalyst in the sense of people feeling different for these reasons.
Is there any evidence that there are therapies that can change sexual orientation or gender identity, right? I mean, that's the foundation of your definition, right? It's a form of therapy that sets as a treatment goal these changes.
Mhm.
Is there evidence that there are any therapies that can actually achieve that goal?
So the evidence we have is really limited. And I feel very open if somebody was to develop a therapy and show evidence of significant changes in attraction, orientation, and identity. I would be interested in that. I would be kind of intrigued by that. We do not have evidence to date that shows those changes. And we don't even have the development of the types of studies that would be able to make that claim. So in order to be able to claim that a therapy causes an outcome, we need to have randomized clinical trials, meaning you're assigning people to one group and assigning people to other group, and neither knows which group they're assigned to. And then you would have to measure them for a long time to be able to account for what we would call in psychology as natural fluidity, meaning it's well observed that people have natural shifts in attraction and orientation and identity over time, over the lifespan, especially women. And so we'd have to be able to follow people for a substantial amount of time to show that we're not just capturing natural fluidity. We'd also have to have people who are getting these types of therapies compared to people who are not getting these types of therapies and observe changes in the realm of attraction and orientation. Mark Yarhouse, who I mentioned at the start, did a longitudinal study where he looked at ministry groups that were seeking to help people change attraction, and he followed them for several years. And the first year was where you saw the most marked changes, and those changes were in the realm of behavior and identity, meaning I stopped sexually acting out and I changed the labels I was using. So maybe I was using same-sex attracted or struggling with same-sex attracted attraction instead of gay. So changes happened in terms of labeling and in terms of sexual behaviors. Those changes did not continue, and people did not experience shifts in attraction or orientation with any level of success. I think it was like 33% reported any shift over the course of, I think it was 7 years. And so even in the realm of ministry, we're not seeing evidence of substantial change. And then I think the most recent, again, research coming out by those who are offering reintegrative therapy has also been really, I think, number one, unclear in how they're presenting their data, but also not showing evidence of substantial changes and persistent changes in attraction and orientation over time. So there's no clear evidence today that substantiates those claims.
Is there evidence that these types of therapies cause additional harm?
Yes, there is certainly evidence of a significant harm from different approaches under the guise of kind of conversion therapy. So now I can tell you that you could look up research around, suicide rates, self-harm, depression from people who look back on their adolescence or their early adulthood and have undergone these interventions. I actually don't think we should need the research, to be honest with you, after we hear from people and we sit with what it would be like to be a teenager with these experiences and then go see a therapist. But we do have data from research, specifically with adults who share with us about their suicidality, their depression, their loss of faith, their alienation from their family, their alienation from their faith community, the self-loathing. And I think it's worth maybe just helping people understand how that happens psychologically for somebody when they go to a conversion therapist, including somebody who's well-meaning, somebody who does not want to harm them. If you go to a therapy and a condition of your kind of psychological well-being is that you are no longer attracted to people of the same sex, or you no longer have gender distress, there is a conditionality to your health. And if this area of your life is unmoved by the therapeutic intervention, and you have a good therapist and you love your therapist and you feel cared for by your therapist, and they seem like a really nice person who's a faithful Christian, and your attractions don't change or your gender distress doesn't change, it's really hard to, as a teenager especially, or a young adult, outsource responsibility for that to the therapy or the therapist, to say the therapy isn't working because it's not effective, or the therapist is not able to deliver on the promise that they made to me or to my parents. So psychologically what happens is that gets turned inward. The person says, I must be bad, I must be defective, I must be flawed. That's the voice of shame. And then that compounds, because remember, there's a spiritual reality at play here. People seek conversion therapy most often because they're people of faith and they recognize the moral complexity to enduring same-sex sexuality. They have moral questions about that and what that means for their life and their relationship with God. So there's also an assumption that God wants them to be free of this. And if they're not free, it's their fault. And that alienates them from their faith. If God's not helping me, I must really be that bad, that he must not care, he must not see me. And that leads to enormous negative effects in terms of spirituality, which on principle we ought to care about, but especially ought to care about because faith and spirituality can be protective factors for people experiencing depression and anxiety and suicidality. And so you're pulling out the rug from under somebody for the number one resource we would like for them to have in coping with life on life's terms, and that's the relationship with God.
Yeah. Does it also impact, I imagine, if one of the foundational psychological premises is that I have these experiences because my parents were too smothering or too distant, doesn't it also have the potential effect of creating tension or even disintegration of the relationship between especially kids, teens, and their parents?
That's such an important piece of this, right? Is that, when we look at the overwhelming research we have of teenagers who are attracted to the same sex, what we find again and again as either the number one or top three protective factors for their mental health, it's the quality of their relationship with their parents. So strengthening the parent-child relationship always has to be a number one goal of therapy. You need to help bridge gaps of communication. You need to help them process resentment and anger towards their parents in healthy ways so there's not alienation. And when you claim in therapy with a minor that their parents are causing their distress in this area, that leads to enormous anger at mom and dad. And not just in the past, right? It's not my parents were smothering. It's my mom when on a Tuesday, she comes in my room and she asks me how my day was. This is the thing that's making me gay. That leads to not just tension. I mean, that's rage, right? Powerlessness. I can't make you stop doing the thing that is leading to this enduring experience in me. And so when we slow that down and think about what's happening to that teenager, yes, alienation, and there is research to support that, that there's a distance in the parent-child relationship, alienation in the parent-child relationship, resentment there at a critical developmental period where they need that relationship. They need to be able to hold both. And my parents are limited, and my parents are not to blame for everything that I'm experiencing. And I think conversion therapy in all of its forms, in some cases unintentionally, in some cases intentionally, alienates the parent-child relationships in really significant ways.
Yeah. I also see, again, thinking at this from like a spiritual abuse lens, that mixing of the role of therapist and then the role of essentially some sort of spiritual guru, some spiritual authority, as, I mean, not only unethical, definitely unethical, but also spiritually abusive in the sense of imposing my religious beliefs and values, and not just a general, not even that this would be appropriate, not just a general Christian beliefs and values onto my client, that would be inappropriate, but even further, specific theological beliefs. Things like we've talked about, about moral disorder and about this transactional understanding of God and sin and suffering, etc. that there's an imposing of those values as just the norm for what health looks like, what progress looks like, okay? But then also, you have someone acting as a spiritual authority, and I've heard stories from people who have endured conversion therapy, who have talked about like spiritual practices being inappropriately become a part of, where you have therapists practicing this, talking about getting prophetic words from the Lord and imposing those on their client as words from God in therapy. In my mind, this is it just seems like an environment that is abusive in itself, and then also so ripe for just continuing spiritual abuse and malpractice to happen.
That's right. And I think that is specific, especially to people in vulnerable situations of all kinds, right? And I think there is a vulnerability coming to therapy anyway. There's an added layer of vulnerability that comes from being a minor and not having some of the psychological and cognitive sophistication to have more nuanced forms of thinking. And there are layers of vulnerability that come from a therapist who has spiritual authority by virtue of their professed faith. And so it is so important to take that responsibility so seriously. And I often, to people who are wishing for access in therapy to efforts to change orientation or identity, I will concede to them, there are no laws that I know of that ban this in adults. We are talking about minors, for starters here, and people who need their parents and are not accessing their parents effectively through these forms of therapy. We're talking about people who are in a spiritual development lens, kind of early in their journey with the Lord, and are susceptible to messaging that is just enough off to really cause enormous psychological and spiritual harm for the lifespan. And I think we ought to protect people from this unless we can really show that it works and that it buffers against the type of harms that we're talking about now.
Yeah. So all of, the last 50 minutes of preamble bring us right to then this law in Colorado and the lawsuit before the Supreme Court. If you could you summarize both what the Colorado law is, and then also why it's being challenged, and then why you ultimately support this law staying in effect?
Yeah, so the law in Colorado is a ban on, again, what we've defined as conversion therapy here. It's banning licensed mental health professionals from attempts or kind of purported change in attraction, orientation, or identity, including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions or eliminate or reduce attraction towards the same sex. So it doesn't ban, and it makes it very clear, it's not banning efforts to kind of accept, support, and understand how to help a person cope with these experiences. It's all for efforts to increase social support, including spiritual support. And it explicitly says that it's allowing identity exploration and development, which means some people will experience natural shifts in attraction or shifts in gender identity over time and over the course of therapy, as long as these efforts are sexual orientation neutral, meaning they're not claiming or trying as the goal of therapy from the provider to change attraction and orientation or identity as such. I'll be honest here that when I first saw this law, I was concerned about the clause where it says, conversion therapy is any effort to change an individual's orientation or gender identity, including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions, or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attraction. I initially was concerned that that meant you can't help a teenager, let's say a gay or straight teenager, who wants to stop pornography use or wants to stop masturbating to fantasy of people of the same or opposite sex, that you couldn't do that because those would be efforts to change behaviors. Well, if you look at the actual way that that law is written, that's a clause, a kind of clause in reference to changing a person's orientation or gender. So the way that law is meant to be understood is that if my goal is to help reduce value incongruent pornography use, I can do that. If my goal is to reduce value incongruent self-stimulation, I can help a client do that. If I'm claiming as the therapist that in doing so, if you stop watching gay pornography or you stop masturbating to fantasies of people of the same sex, you will experience a change in orientation or gender identity. That's what the law bans. And I actually think some people have challenged me on this and said, well, you're saying that, but the law doesn't say that. But I think the law, in kind of simple terms of grammar, as we understand it, makes it very clear that this is in reference to an overall change in orientation and identity, not changes of behaviors of all types with minors as such. So I think that kind of captures one of the biggest controversies with the law. The other concern with this law is that it's viewpoint discrimination, meaning that it associates itself with a viewpoint on human sexuality that's kind of theological and philosophical. And to that, I would say, number one, this law with minors in particular, banning this therapy in only minors through licensed mental health professionals, has never led to any kind of retaliation towards any therapist. It has never even been applied in the state of Colorado since 2019. So some of the narrative that has been out there about this law is that it's keeping therapists from doing good work in this area. And because there's this threat of fines. Well, it's never even been applied. So I'm trying to understand, like, where are all these therapists who have been so targeted for their religious beliefs with this law? Now, the challenge to that would be, well, isn't it scaring therapists away from doing effective therapy? And that's a good question, to be honest. We ought to be concerned about any law that hinders a therapist's ability to do their job, because we have to be able to do our job effectively. We do not want the state telling us from a viewpoint perspective what we can and cannot do in therapy. But this is why it's so important to notice what the law bans. The law is banning a treatment approach. It's not banning a therapist who has a particular viewpoint. If it was, I would be writing an amicus brief for the other side. It's not saying, here's the beliefs you have to have about marriage. Here's beliefs you have to have about gender transition to do therapy in the state of Colorado. That would be very concerning viewpoint discrimination. It's saying that you can't do form of therapy that have been shown to cause harm and have not been deemed effective with a population that's in a vulnerable situation when they step into your office, which is sexual minority and gender minority minors. That when they're adults, they can go seek that through ministry. They can even seek it through ministry as a minor. The law does nothing in the realm of ministry or kind of pastoral roles. It's only banning this with licensed providers who have a license from the state, because that approach has not been shown to be helpful and has been shown to be harmful.
So you're a Catholic, you're a licensed psychologist in the state of Colorado, and you work with minors on issues surrounding gender and sexuality and faith. Have you ever felt like this law has constrained you doing good work?
That's a great question. So I actually think the thing that would constrain and has constrained me from doing good work is fear. Therapists have a lot of fear of lawsuits, of fines, of doing it wrong. We're usually highly conscientious people. And so I think I have had fear of hurting somebody. So the question becomes, is that a good fear to have? the fear of, like, I might actually cause harm because this person is coming to me in a vulnerable situation. Or is the law the problem? I actually think the fear and the caution that I experience from having laws like this protecting minors is a very helpful fear, because it makes me added in my kind of scrupulosity of myself as I'm working with people. So the fear I do have from a law like this, I think is a very healthy fear to have, because it gives me kind of a caution with people in vulnerable situations. Does it impede my ability to do good work? The answer to that is no. Mark Yarhouse has developed an approach that's a third way model to addressing sexual orientation and faith conflicts in therapy. It's called sexual identity therapy. And he and I developed a very parallel approach called gender and religious identity therapy as a third way model that's not gay and trans affirming care and is not conversion therapy. That was meant to say we have highly religious people who want to glorify God in their lives and usually are theologically conservative. What therapy is available to them? And we've tried to help people live in what we call value congruent ways, right? And that law is fully allowed under the law as it's written. It involves acceptance, support, facilitating individual coping, social support, and identity exploration and development. And I have clients who come to see me and have a range of outcomes through those forms of therapy. Some are theologically conservative over the course of therapy and they abstain from all sexual activity because that's very important to them. Some people don't identify as the opposite sex. They kind of find other ways to manage that. Some people do experience kind of shifts in identity towards transgender identity. I mean, it's kind of like all forms of therapy, Paul, where we do good work with people. We can't guarantee how it's all going to end up. But in my conversations with the Attorney General's Office of Colorado, where I shared all about these approaches, they were so excited that that existed. They were so grateful that conventionally religious therapists can offer therapy that is value congruent and is also effective and not harmful. And there were no concerns about the approaches that me and others like me are offering in Colorado with minors, as long as we weren't claiming that we could change a person's sexual orientation at the start of therapy or change their gender. So that's been my experience for the 7 years that I've been here.
So if you and therapists like you can do good work without any negative impact from this law, and if the law hasn't even been used, then frankly, what's the opposition to this law?
Mm-hmm.
And why has the Catholic Church also, why has the USCCB come out in support of this lawsuit in opposition to this law? I mean, that seems surprising to me in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. The argument made by Kaylee Chiles and her representation and Kaylee Chiles is, again, the Christian therapist who filed the lawsuit against the state of Colorado here and is claiming that this is a violation of her free speech. I think the argument they're making is that it is kind of proactively requiring therapists to filter speech in a way that does harm to themselves and keeps people from receiving care. Now, if I give Kaylee Chiles and others like her who are concerned about this law the benefit of the doubt, I already mentioned I was concerned about this law when it came out. I assume that they haven't heard of third way approaches like Mark Yarhouse's approach, and that they're not well versed and well trained in how to do effective work in this area. And so they feel very afraid that they're going to mess up. And so they do opt out. Now, in the field of psychology and counseling, when we don't feel effective, we have a couple of options for what we do with that. We can call our ethics board and we can ask questions about laws that exist and make sure we're doing right by people. We can go seek further training specific to these areas and get trained in third way approaches that allow us to be effective. We can consult with attorneys to see, what are the long-term problems here that could arise and how do we buffer against that. And so I'm not seeing the due diligence. I'm seeing lawsuits. And I do think that, the USCCB and other organizations that have filed lawsuits in this area, certainly they're not licensed mental health providers, so they're not going to be familiar with some of the language that is coming through these laws that comes directly from the American Psychological Association and American Counseling Association that has been, guidance that we've been following for over 2 decades now. And I think that many people are really concerned about obstructions to religious freedom, rightfully so, obstructions to freedom of speech. And I think that argument is compelling. And I think people who are not well versed in these things will sign on to an amicus brief written by lawyers if it's framed as there's a risk here to freedom of speech. Uh, Therapy, in my mind, is about medical intervention. It's not about me talking at the dinner table or with friends or with people at church about my beliefs. And so that distinction is lost, I think, in the USCCB amicus brief. I think it's lost in others like it. When I read those briefs, to be honest, I don't disagree with what's being said in them on the whole. I think they're really good arguments for why we ought to protect freedom of speech and what's at stake if we don't in the realm of sexuality and gender. I just don't think they apply to this law because of a lot of the misunderstandings and how it's been framed.
Yeah. I think maybe I'm not quite as generous as you are. So yeah, I'll throw some other stuff out there. So it seems to me that it isn't just fear of like loss of freedom of speech or freedom of religion. It seems to be that there is a active support within American Catholicism of conversion therapy, and a active adoption of both the psychological and theological premises that we've talked about as not just a Catholic approach, but as the orthodox and only Catholic approach to understanding sexual orientation and gender. So I think back to 2 years ago when we first met. It was I reached out to you following up a phone call I got from someone at Catholic Charities in my previous diocese who had reached out to me to see if me as a therapist in the area could be a referral for their clients. The call very unfortunately and quickly turned into what felt like an interrogation of my orthodoxy. When being asked, I expressed that I would not impose my religious values onto clients because that would be profoundly unethical. The next day, I learned that my old diocese was in an active lawsuit against the state of Michigan and my own professional board in opposition to a state law banning conversion therapy on minors, very similar, if not identical, to Colorado's law. And they argued that it violated their religious freedom as Catholic therapists. This led to several different conversations. I reached out to a few different people, you being one of them and the most helpful person I reached out to. But it seems like, I see popular ministries like Courage or like Desert Streams Living Waters, which I don't think is formally Catholic, but has Catholics in it, and I see endorsed by Catholic dioceses. They seem to share these psychological and theological presumptions of conversion therapy. So I guess my assessment is that it's not only fear of loss of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but it is active support of conversion therapy by American Catholics or American conservative Catholics. Would you agree with that assessment? Like, how did this become a normative stance within Catholicism if it seems not just like bad therapy and bad science, but also bad theology?
Yeah. That's such a great point, Paul. I really appreciate you bringing it up because I have experienced what you've experienced, which is that there is a strong allegiance in American Catholicism to the claims of conversion therapy and how it's applied to gender and sexuality. I think so this is helping me nuance kind of what I'm saying here a little bit more. I think, do I think the US Catholic bishops sat down in a room and signed a document and wrote it out because they want access to conversion therapy? No. Do I think US Catholic bishops have been given the opportunity to be educated on the harms of conversion therapy and the lack of efficacy for it? No. And so, in that sense, I think there are well meaning people. And to be clear, my guess is amicus briefs are written by lawyers and signed by committees, but even if they were signed by all the bishops, I think I don't know that our bishops kind of have had access to the information they need. I think there are lay Catholics who are very staunch advocates for conversion therapy and have framed it in theological language that is inaccurate and harmful, and have been effective in doing so. And I have experienced in the last year of speaking publicly about things that I've thought and practiced from for a long time, that there has been pretty enormous and remarkable hostility around the challenges that I'm giving to conversion therapy. And these are coming from faithful Catholics. And so I think that speaks to what you're saying, which is I think there's a wedded kind of blending here of things that are not theologically accurate with our Catholic beliefs.
I mean, if I'm being honest, it's probably only, certainly in the past decade, maybe only in the last 5 or 6 years, that I didn't just presume that homosexuality was caused by trauma.
Correct.
And it wasn't like I was hanging out in really fringe, like right-wing Catholic circles. I was hanging out in mainstream circles, listening to mainstream Catholic speakers and going to mainstream Catholic conferences. And that was the normative stance is that if you're gay, you must have had some childhood trauma, probably from one of your parents.
That's correct. And I think that, that speaks to a wider, broader concern and point of responsibility for the church that I think probably also helps us understand the reactivity to laws like this. Is I think if what you're saying is true, and I believe that it is true, which is in our mainstream conversations, there's a taken for granted assumption that we've made about homosexuality that's wrong. And that assumption has hurt people. And it has not just hurt people psychologically, it has hurt them spiritually, and some are no longer alive. We would be in a position to take some real responsibility and repent of things that we have been complicit in that are wrong and mar the human dignity of the person. And the defense mechanism that we employ when we don't want to do that is rationalization and intellectualization and a kind of argument around free speech that I think protects us from having to look in the mirror for the ways we've been complicit in narratives that have not been shown to be psychologically grounded, scientifically grounded, or theologically grounded. And I think that explains the wide harm that I've witnessed again and again as a psychologist meeting with these individuals and families.
Yeah. We are well past an hour at this point, but I wanted to ask too, and you've touched on this some. If this law is struck down, and equivalent laws across the country in different states struck down, what concerns do you have about the potential negative consequences, both as a therapist, but then also specifically as a Catholic therapist? What challenges or harms do you see being caused by this striking down of laws prohibiting conversion therapy on minors?
Yeah, well, that's where I think the efforts of Kaylee Chiles and others are really just short-sighted. The concerns they bring up in their argument is that young, vulnerable teens are going to therapists that are progressive and not able to maintain their beliefs. If the observation from Catholic and non-Catholic teenagers is that Catholics and Christians more broadly are pro-conversion therapy, those teens today will be less likely to go see a faith-based therapist after a law like this changes, because it's already the case in a state like Colorado that if clients know that I'm a person of faith, teenage clients, they don't trust me by virtue of me being a Christian, because they assume what you've experienced, which is that every mainstream Christian in this area is pro-conversion therapy. So the law has been very helpful actually in building trust to say, if I was to ever do anything that sniffed of conversion therapy, I want you to go to the licensing board because it's against the law. I want you to go to the state of Colorado and I want you to go to the ethics board and make a report because you ought to do that if a therapist is breaking the law. Well, without the law, I think less and less teenagers are going to be inclined to go to a faith-based clinician because they won't trust us by virtue of us being people of faith. So that's one harm. The other harm that I see is that, and maybe there's two more, another harm that I see is young people will go to their peers and social media to try out all of this and not have the support of a therapist at all, because they will say, we don't trust you, we don't need you, we don't want you. And that, really shuts down some of the identity exploration and development that therapy can be helpful with in these areas and many others. And then what I saw happening after many people experienced harms from conversion therapy is they avoid therapy altogether. So if there's an assumption that you could go to a faith-based therapist, if you go to a therapist at all, and you might get kind of coerced into something like conversion therapy, and they might say it's not conversion therapy and it's not conversion therapy, it's definitely not conversion therapy, but it might still be a lot of those assumptions. People will avoid therapy altogether. And when people who have diagnosed mental health concerns like depression and anxiety and suicidality avoid therapy, their symptoms worsen over time. And I worry about that for minors in a particular way. I worry about it for adults in situations that are vulnerable by virtue of having some of these difficulties and not having access points that they can count on that won't do harm. So I think we're going to see less teens trusting Christian therapists. I think there will be reason for that, because I think we will see some therapists try to do this work who have not been well trained. And I think the ripple effects of that are going to be unhelpful to people, to families, and to the mental health and spiritual health of these teens.
Yeah, I agree with all of that very much. I also see, even setting aside being a Catholic therapist, just being a therapist, the work that I do with my clients isn't the same as when I get a beer with my brother-in-law on Friday night.
That's right.
Isn't the same as this podcast or the things I write on my Substack. It is intentional therapeutic technique. It's understood in the United States as I'm a medical provider. If what I do in therapy with clients is deemed to be not able to be regulated because it's free speech, then it seems to me like the profession of therapy just completely disintegrates, because it essentially says, not just to therapists, but to everyone who may seek therapy, well, my therapist can just say whatever the hell they want, as if they're having a beer with their brother-in-law on Friday night.
That's correct. We've done a ton of work in the last 2 decades to reduce stigma around therapy, to be clear about what it is and what it isn't, and to help people, and not just people, but insurance companies see it as a medical intervention that is worthy of coverage, right? And this is another way in which this argument around free speech and therapy has seemed really problematic to me and very short-sighted, is that if we frame therapy as speech, like we frame everything else as speech, like talking with your friend at a bar or talking with me right now, then we undermine the credibility of something that has the potential to save people's lives. And not just that, but do a lot of other good for people's overall health and well-being. And if we make the claim that it's merely speech, we lose credence to have it be covered by insurance, which has been a long-standing effort in our field. And so it's so undermining of that credibility in a very profound way. And the fact that that argument is working, I actually think speaks to some of the stigma that very much still exists and lack of understanding about what we're actually doing in therapy.
Oh. This conversation has been so good. We are way over time. Thank you for being generous with your time. Is there anything on this topic that you wanted to talk about that I didn't get to?
I think I'll just say two things. The first thing being that the argument here that has made Chiles' case so compelling is that you can't do effective integrative faith-based therapy in this realm because of laws like this. And I can't say enough that the only reason that I wrote an amicus brief at all was it felt like a matter of integrity, because that's simply not true. I am practicing in the state of Colorado with minors all the time, many of whom are theologically conservative and very able under this law to continue to use therapy to live in accordance with their beliefs and values. The law is restrictive of what I can use as interventions in therapy and what I can and can't promise as claims by being a licensed provider. So I just want to be so clear about that. People can change behaviors, they can change identity, they can experience shifts in attraction and orientation over the course of therapy as minors. The distinction is what the therapist is doing, what the therapist is promising under the guise of mental health care. I always do want to end with a bit of hope and groundedness in another reality here for people listening who may be feeling like this is really discouraging. And I can honor that. I feel that as well, of what's at stake if a law like this is overturned. I just want to remind people listening, and you know this very well, Paul, that even when there's not a law in place to ban something, we have ethics boards that people can go to and ought to go to and get support in going to when a therapist is causing harm. And if you are listening and you know of somebody who has experienced conversion therapy, or you know of somebody who has been mistreated in the therapeutic context, please know that ethics boards exist for you to go and make reports, and that will not change if this law is overturned, that you will always have recourse to hold therapists accountable for harmful practices. And conversion therapy is one of those harmful practices. And so it's not as if there's no recourse after a law like this may be overturned. And I will say that younger generations are very clear about the fact that they don't want these approaches generally. And that is their own protective factor that we can really support and affirm in our families and in our churches and in our communities.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any resources? I'm going to link to your amicus brief. I'm going to link to the books that you co-wrote with Mark Yarhouse. Mm-hmm. Are there any other resources you think would be helpful for listeners if they want to learn about any of this more? And then along with that, where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah, so there's a website that has been developed. I'll send the link to you for it, for families who might be inclined to seek conversion therapy, that you can send families to get access to a third way approach that accounts for their beliefs and is also debunking some of the myths of conversion therapy. So I'll make sure that you have that link to that site, so people who are in these situations can know where to turn. To follow my work, my website is juliasadusky.com. And if families are seeking support from therapists or want recommendations for trustworthy therapists, people can always reach out through that website to get access to care that's going to be honoring of your beliefs and also protective of the mental health of your family. So that's available. And then, of course, I'm on social media, Substack a little bit, if people want to follow along.
Wonderful. Now, Julia, thank you so much.
Yeah, so good to be with you, Paul. Thanks for talking.
And thank you for listening to the Third Space podcast. If you like this conversation, please subscribe. Episodes will be released every other week. Please share it with a friend and give it a rating and review in your favorite podcast app so that more people can discover the show. You can sign up for my newsletter or send me a message at catholicthirdspace.com. And while you're there, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. All of your support directly helps my family and allows me to continue working on projects like this podcast. If you want to schedule individual coaching with me or have me out to speak or consult with your parish, diocese, seminary, or religious community, please visit livingsolidarity.com. You can also join me at Smart Catholics, the online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations that go beyond easy answers or black and white fundamentalism. That's smartcatholics.com. Thanks for listening.